This is the Book Legion Podcast, where we review thought-provoking books to give our Legionnaires the knowledge they need to dominate the next level of their life.
Thanks everybody for tuning in to the Book Legion. This is your host, Tyser Evans. This week we're going to be reviewing the book In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. If you're not familiar with who Yeonmi is or her story, it's really kind of crazy. I heard it on Rogan about a year ago. But Yeonmi, she was born in North Korea in the northern province, pretty close to northern province where China was just right over a neighboring river. Why I wanted to read this book and cover it on here, I know it's a bit different. I think there's a lot of takeaways you can get from her story. So Yeonmi says she was born in North Korea in 1993, so right when Kim Jong-un II was still in power, who had taken over from his father, who had started the dictatorship in North Korea when they split from one back in the 50s, and now is still under dictatorship rule by Kim Jong-un and is one of the poorest, most authoritarian countries on the planet. Podcast has really been about all kinds of acquiring different types of skills and how do we better ourselves, and with sales or leadership or health or our wellness, right, or our wealth, and all pillars of our life. But why I wanted to look at this book is understanding things you can learn from other people's stories can be just as powerful as opposed to reading a book just on habits, right? So what I want to talk to you guys today was her story was really incredible. She was born in North Korea in 1993. Her family actually does okay compared to a lot of the other families in North Korea. But what happens is her dad ends up committing a crime. He's kind of involved in this underground trading market that they have there where they bring goods over from China. Because again, this country, if you've ever looked at it on a map versus South Korea, China, and Mongolia, which the countries that surround it, North Korea is completely black. At night. They don't have running electricity. They do, but they cycle it through just a few of their main cities in the country. All of their rations are really food supplies go to the military. They have one of the largest militaries on earth, and obviously they're a nuclear threat, which is why they're constantly in the news. They were closely aligned with the Soviet Union until it collapsed, which is one of the reasons why they have been in such a bad, dire position over the last 30 years, because they are heavily subsidized by the Soviet Union and China. So the book talks a little bit about kind of the buildup. She does a good job of setting the pretext of why North Carolina is the way it is, and she goes into full details about how they grew up, that really them starving to death, seeing people starving to death, having to eat grasshoppers, having to eat dragonflies is something that she talks about as being a delicacy. Eggs were cooked once a year for New Year's. So the book is, a very heart-wrenching story. She ends up, fleeing and getting out of North Korea. And I don't want to give it away because it's really, it's a phenomenal story, very heart-lifting, as much as it is heart-wrenching with the things that she had to go through and had to endure, not only herself, but her sister, her mother. Basically, her and her mother do end up getting trafficked. Her sister did, but her sister was on her own. Her father has his own struggles between the prison camp and whatnot. So I said it was really heart-wrenching, but I want to talk to you about my 3 takeaways I got from the book about this story where, eventually she does make it out and into South Korea, and eventually actually even comes to the United States and goes to Colombia. And she talks a lot about what's the kind of some of the parallels of what's transgressing right now in the United States with more of a progressive socialist type movement, and how she came here and some of the things that she's seen versus North Korea. It was really interesting to get her take on that with where we're at with our society today, being an American myself. But my first, really big takeaway was just that, like, how much that those of us who live in abundance, that we really don't pay attention to the small things in life. Even those of us who have gratitude practices, I think that oftentimes we still don't pay attention to the small things, like that you got 3 meals today, right? That you didn't even have to consciously think about food. Not only did you have to think about food because your house is stocked with it, when you need to go get food, you don't have to wonder where it's going to come from. You just go to the grocery store and you have shelves that are stocked with everything you could ever possibly want or need. Where these people, they literally lived from meal to meal. She talks about, skin falling off of their body because they're so malnourished. Herself, I mean, when she went on Rogan, he was talking about how small she was, and I think at the time she was like 80 or 85 pounds. So she got below 70 pounds at some points as a full-grown woman in the story because there's such a lack of resources and lack of food. So it just really brought me back to this place of gratitude again and looking at my life. I mean, some of the things she said, like when she first got to China, she saw more food in the trash than she had seen in like the last 6 months. And you're just like, whoa, man, like we don't even consciously think about that. You don't eat all your leftovers, you got a little bit left on your plate, you throw it out. That they don't do that at all. And the fact that all of the meals that they get in North Korea, they share with their neighbors and people they're close with, so they can all make sure that everybody's eating. So they're very selfless people and very community oriented, but again, they've been brainwashed that they don't believe in God. They believe that the Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il and his father before him, that they're gods, that they're literal gods. She even thought that they could hear her thoughts. So they've been trained and brainwashed to just think that the state is God. So it was really weird that they had this great sense of community where they all came together and really did help each other. But they didn't have any like spiritual context around it at all, because everything was about worshiping the God. And ironically, I reread 1984 about 3 months ago, and it is literally, it's almost like that dictator took, Eric Blair, George Orwell's book, and that was his playbook for a society, because it was like really no difference with the double speak, condensing the language to remove words like the word love. They had no word for that. She didn't have a real concept. She kind of understood like what the feeling, but there was no word for it. So that was just, anyway, the first big takeaway for me was that I could do a lot better job in my life of being grateful for the really simple, small things that I don't think about or I don't have to think about. The second takeaway for me also was I could give more. It just made me think about how much abundance that I really do live in. I think about the excess of like the pairs of shoes that I have, or hats, or clothing, or just even books, right? And that I could give more. I currently do donate to 4 charities, but I could give more money to those charities every month. Or I could carry around, there's people that I know that carry around bags of food and a bottle of water for homeless people when I see them. So maybe they don't have to give them money, they give them their next meal, which I think is more impactful, because then that they're going to eat it and drink the water as opposed to use the money for things that wouldn't be good for them. So I think that this also made me think about so much of how we don't always think outside of the scope of what's happening here in the United States, or even within your city or your state, and think in confines of how other people live around the world. I think this kind of ties in with number one, just being more grateful that there are people that have it so much worse than we have it here in the United States. What we would be considered to be poverty would typically be middle class or upper middle class for most countries. She talks about some of the wages they got were equivalent to like $1 a week that they would get for some of the work that they would do in different places of China and in North Korea. So, we can't even conceptualize that, so when they're trying to save money to buy food and you're making $1 a week, but then yet a bowl of rice is 35 cents, it's just those things we don't think about, but we also don't think about how much like giving $20 a month to a charity to us means nothing, but to the charity and to the dollars that can go to help more people, can mean all the difference in the world between living and dying. And so it just made me, again, I feel like, because I am well read and I do read a lot, that I am conscientious of world events, but I could give more to the places that I know that are hurting. And then the last thing is just, thinking about home and watching what happened with this country and how these people, only took 2 generations for them to lose their freedoms and completely forget about the freedoms that they did have and the freedoms that South Korea had, because they were brainwashed that South Korea in particular and the United States were all like murderers and rapists, and they were all evil people. We're the American bastards, and that South Koreans were even worse than Americans. And so just, within a span of 30 years, you can go from living together, all having one language as a country, to this part of the country not having any electricity and being completely brainwashed. And so for us, living in the United States, the Constitution is really, in my eyes, more like a spiritual document. I know there's a lot of controversy around the people who wrote it. We don't need to go there. I think that the intention of why it was written, that truth still stands today. I think that the freedoms that we've been able to create in this country need to be protected, because it's a slippery slope of what happens when you start to give away some of those freedoms to a government and you start to make people more powerful, and the people have less of a voice and have less of a way to protect themselves. Then things turn ugly. If you look at every single empire in history where more power went to the autocracy or to a patriarchy, it was always ended up bad for the people, like really bad, catastrophically bad, where millions of people died. So I think it's really important to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. You have your own house in order with self-discipline. You're read up on the Constitution. You understand how money makes. I think that we could all do a much better job of owning our own freedoms and protecting them. Be involved in your local city council. I think that if anything, if COVID taught you, whether you like the politics one way or the other, the more you're involved, the more you will see your voice will be heard. So the more you will see the things that are important to you happening in your local community. And so that's where it's really got to start. But we have to take the process really seriously, and a lot of us don't, and then we just complain about it afterward, that these people are ruining our country. But you have every chance to go step up and be a leader and be a voice in your community, and you can be the one running, as opposed to allowing other people to do it and then you complaining about them. So I think for me, I think we could do a better job of implementing better self-discipline and self-responsibility and really own and protect our own freedoms. So something like that would not ever happen here in this country, and that we can still continue to really truly be a beacon for the rest of the world. What happens when citizens stand up and they own their own individual freedoms, and they tell a government that, no, you work for us, as opposed to the other way around. So anyway, the book was phenomenal. Said I blew through it in about 4 or 5 days. She did a great job writing it. She does have I think a sequel or a second book coming out at the beginning of 2023. I've already pre-ordered that, but this one was only $10. I'll put the link in the description below, so go check it out. And said she's done a Lex Friedman podcast and was on the Joe Rogan podcast. If you want to listen to her tell her story, to both of them, you can listen to both. It doesn't ruin the book and it doesn't ruin the podcast, because the book's going to go into a bit more detail than the podcast does, but both are really powerful. So anyway, if you guys haven't done so, check out my other podcast, Grind, Sell, Elevate. It's where I interview business leaders, entrepreneurs from all different walks of business. So you can find that on all different types of podcast platforms. There's a link for it in the show notes. And then also my brand here, I've got Odin's Rune is an apparel brand that I've started that's motivational themed with kind of a Nordic twist to it. So check that out, odinsrune.com. All right, we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks so much.